Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insight Live, the IT Experts Take. I'm Jason Rader, your host, and today's topic, we're going to be talking about breaking the cycle of technical debt. And we got two old favorites with us today. We have Juan Orlandini, who is the CTO and Distinguished Engineer for us at Insight, and we have Senior Architect and Distinguished Engineer, Carm Tagliente. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, how are you
Thanks.
doing?
Great to be back.
So, free-form, crazy discussion on tech debt. And I know there's going to be maybe some folks that have to drop off, but we're probably going to contain the topic to 30-ish minutes today, so we should be okay. But Carm, if we go long, you're just going to have to drop, okay?
That's right. No worries.
Because Juan and I can go the distance.
My avatar will take over for me. All good.
So let's kick it off for the folks that you're probably not hearing that term for the first time, but what do we mean when we say technical debt?
So I'll take a stab at it, and I'm going to be somewhat colloquial about it because there's actually a technical term for it or a definition for it. It's really just the cruft and the crud that builds up in any system that you build, all right, over time. It's decisions that you make at a point in time that get invalidated over the distance because technology matures and systems change and there's a new world that we live in. And if you're not careful with managing it, it becomes really hard to take care of. And that becomes technical debt.
Okay. I like that.
Just to augment on what Juan's saying, totally agree with you. And it tends to be also, I like this concept of care and feeding. So to that point, it's sort of how well you're taking care of your current investments in technology. And if you're not keeping up to date, well, then of course, some things you can build up some technical debt. But I also think sometimes it's also decision-making that you're in the beginning of starting a new project, new concept, innovation, and you cut some corners. So it's intentional, but by cutting the corners, you actually create your own technical debt. So now it becomes all of a sudden production, which we all know that never happens, but of course it does. And then now you have these products in production and you have to think about, well, how do I then scale them, or how do I sort of accommodate for that technical debt in order to allow me to be able to take advantage of the capabilities that I'm trying to drive within the organization.
That's 100% right. And it's interesting, though, even if you don't end up cutting corners and you're using the prevailing wisdom of the day, that might actually turn out to be something that gets aged out rather quickly. So how many of us are maintaining Perl code bases, right? And back in the early days of the web, I mean, everything was running on Perl, and now you just don't see it anymore, right?
Well, can I interject? So
Sure.
I was going to say, I love both of your definitions, but I want to clarify, tech debt isn't that you made a bad decision or
That's right.
You should have done more research. It's going to happen eventually as time progresses. So, and it could be you went with the flavor of the day, which seemed like the right choice, and then that flavor came out of fashion, and you weren't, I think to Carm's point, you weren't kind of strategizing with it along the way. The care and feeding, I think, is the aspect that really you need to pay attention to, because you need to be looking all along as opposed to just looking 15 years later and going, oh man, we got a whole bunch of work to do.
Well, you know what? Flavor of the day kind of doesn't really paint it right, because that means almost kind of like you're making a poor choice because you're
fashionable decision.
Fashionable choice, right?
Yeah.
It's the prevailing wisdom is a better way to approach it.
That is better.
All right. And the prevailing wisdom of the time says you do this. Not one time prevailing wisdom was Fortran and COBOL, and then it became C, and then it became C#, and then it became Java, and then all the different things that it's become, right, over the years. But that can also be said. I've been talking about software and the software stacks, and I mean, we can go into infinite recursion into what makes up a software stack, right? But there's also hardware that becomes technical debt over time as well. At one point, the prevailing wisdom was you have to have your own data centers, right? And you build your own stacks and you run physical machines, and then it became virtual machines, and then all of a sudden public clouds became available, and that stuff became kind of old wisdom, not prevailing wisdom. And we have to deal with all that stuff, right? And that's technical debt.
I love that. I wonder how inflammatory it is to kind of make the statement that having a data center is tech debt at this point. But I like it. It's interesting to think about.
Well, it's a good question, because there is an active, healthy debate right now as to whether or not we should be living in a cloud-only world or in a hybrid world, or something in between to be defined. And you know, it was almost a foregone conclusion a few years ago that everybody was going to end up in the cloud. And now I think the pendulum has swung to a little bit more of a centered approach. And they're not claiming that one is better than the other. The cloud is better than the data center is better than the cloud, whatever, right? They both have their uses, and it just becomes a matter of making sure that you have the right kind of decision-making process and picking which one you're going to use.
Right.
I love how you kind of set that up, because it would imply that maybe going to the cloud, if we had done it early on, we might be suffering for some tech debt that we have dealing with cloud at this point. Is that fair?
Well, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say well, one of the interesting facets of this is that if we think about what the cloud actually is, instead of strictly infrastructure, if we think about software as a service or platform as a service models, there are some capabilities there which are related to I'll call it updating of the technical infrastructure that is done for you. So some ways, if you think about this, the debt can be managed. It's a shared responsibility model that's very popular in the cloud, is that they can take on some of that technical debt for you, if you will. So by saying, I'm going to update your operating system, I'm going to add in new features and functionality to the managed services that we're providing for you. And that's one way to not avoid it, but certainly one way to say, I know who's responsible for it, and I'm still going to allow it to be, part of my overall strategy. Because, eventually there's this concept of mechanical sympathy. And I think this is what Juan was talking about, where if there's a better technology, even if you are in a managed service and they're taking care of the technical debt for that product for you, maybe it's not the right product, like the SQL, NoSQL debate, or some other kinds of, technology shifts that you might want to take advantage of. You still have to worry about that one. But kind of the mundane ones, which are, oh yeah, I put, if it, remember the old adage, if it's not broke, don't fix it. It's like sometimes it just sits around and you're like, oh, well, I don't have to touch it, so just leave it be. And that generates technical debt too. So, yeah.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that, though, Carm, even with a managed service, you kind of have shifted the technical debt to them, but they still have to incur it themselves. And at some point, that's going to get manifested back to you, right? Because you do have to take advantage of newer capabilities or technologies or stacks that they're exposing. Just recently, I helped a friend that's running a Heroku stack. And Heroku aged out one of their stacks, and she had to redeploy her entire thing and adopt one of the newer Heroku stacks, right? And that was a process that we had to go and adopt and manage some of the code and update some of the code and do all this other kind of stuff. And that's a fully managed deployment of an application in the cloud. I mean, the Heroku cloud, right? And there was nothing you could do about it. Heroku decided, I'm not going to support this older version anymore. Now it's on you to fix your code that's running on my service, right? So it's all over the place. You got to be careful.
And let me bring up the survey question that we did. Thanks to everybody who filled out the survey, by the way. What is the top cause of technical debt in your organization? And the options were rushed development cycles, lack of technical knowledge, legacy system architecture, or incomplete software testing. And overwhelmingly legacy system architecture, which has kind of been what we've been talking about here to a degree. But I think I'm actually surprised lack of technical knowledge was so high, because it was the second one. But rushed development cycles and incomplete software testing, who wants to kind of jump on that one? Because I think that's something we don't talk about a lot.
Although I'm actually going to jump on the surprise for you, the lack of technical knowledge. And I kind of touched on it obliquely on a second ago, all right? Is think about aging systems that we've been maintaining for a long time. And then we have an aging IT staff that is aging out of the workforce. All right. And then all of a sudden now you got to go find somebody that knows how to do COBOL code on a mainframe. Or knows how to do
Barry. Don't ever mess with Barry. He's grumpy, but he's the only guy who knows what he does. Yeah.
Right. And that's actually, it's not that you don't have technical people, is that you just they have been trained and are current on newer technologies than maybe your legacy code is. All right. So that's my suspicion as to why that popped up as high as it did.
Yeah. And I actually think from the testing perspective, I mean, I think it all kind of goes together. I think these are really just sort of different facets of the same problem, like speed to, trying to get things done quickly, delivery cycles or testing. And when you think about it, some of these strategies that we put in place, CI/CD pipelines, testing, et cetera, are types of cross-validation. So you either have principled approaches where you're very cognizant about what you're delivering or how to deliver it, which is part of training, but also framework implementations, best practices, principles. And then the second one is during the process of testing and validation, where you're sort of checking, did I do things the right way? Not necessarily from a principled development perspective, but maybe from a, does it function as we expected it to? And they all kind of hit on the same problem. Like if you're not really focusing on the cutting the corners, if you will, to get things out quickly, you don't really have the ability to catch it on the way, and it could actually produce technical debt at some point in the future. Because, you know, and I guess in the case of the Q&A issue, am I releasing in bugs or whatnot, which may be considered technical debt, right? Because it's sort of like we didn't implement things properly. Is that technical debt? Kind of, maybe, but it's, you know, I think they're all related.
Yeah, I mean, that's pay me now or pay me later. It's the rush development cycles and the incomplete software testing. To me, those are avoidable with good governance and processes in place. The legacy architecture is gonna happen eventually, I think.
No matter what. Yep.
You don't think?
Oh, it will. 100%. 100%.
Juan wants to do COBOL. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, actually, one of the first languages to learn was COBOL. This gray hair is proof of that, right? Maybe there's a retirement thing I could do where I could do some COBOL programming and make a lot
Teach
of
teenagers how to program in COBOL.
Yeah, there you go.
GPT stuff now. Speaking of GPT,
here we go.
you say about that, Carm?
Yes.
It's actually it's timely that you bring that up, because we just at our world headquarters in Chandler, Arizona, Carm and I just hosted 24 clients for an EBC on generative AI and how to leverage AI technologies in general. And one of the things that we spent some time on is code generation and how these large language models and other tools like that are able to accelerate the development of new features or software in general. And it was actually a very lively discussion outside of the topic for today, because we could probably spend 20 hours on that one alone. But it's largely to be defined or determined whether or not that's going to be the panacea that is being painted as right now, right? Because there's also an interesting coincidence is TOB, I'm pretty sure it's TOB, who just released their ranking of programming languages. I think it was yesterday. And what they saw was very little of movement in the languages. And they see that as actually fairly common, but this was exceptionally little movement in the popularity of languages. And one of the things that they're wondering is if the large language models that are being increasingly used to develop code are a culprit of that, because those models are trained on the corpus of knowledge that exists. So new languages like, say, Rust or one of those kinds of things, which are gaining popularity in some respects, are not moving up in that thing. So it kind of, I don't know, it could accelerate innovation, but it could stifle it. So it's to be determined. I don't know.
Does that stifle it, or does that enable it actually for them to deal with that debt that they had when they cut some corners earlier, that pay me now or pay me later aspect? I know you want to say something, Carm. Go ahead, bud.
Yeah, no, it's a great, and I love this topic, and we could probably spend, you know, a lot of time talking about it. But in general, Juan's right. It's I think that is an issue, but I think the productivity benefit today, especially with things like GitHub, Copilot, and even the large language model in its general form, allow you to be able to generate code more quickly and more productively. So, and actually by following best practices as is defined by the corpus of information, to Juan's point. But in that case, it's really just, you can then you can minimize the technical debt. So it's like, oh yeah, did you make that mistake where you didn't include you didn't capture an exception in your code. So if you didn't have an exception handler, that's a bad thing. But those are all things that will come in as part of your implementation strategy because the engine already understands it. So I think that's a huge piece of it. And there are many tools out there, even open source ones like Code Complete, for example. There are other large language models that will help you to be able to do code more effectively. And I think over time, we'll start to be able to really look at it more from the, I'll call it interactive. As the models get better, hopefully we can sort of reduce the amount of time it takes between new generations so that we can capture things like Rust. But interestingly, and I don't want to get into prompt engineering too much yet, but we can talk about it. But you can actually tell it to learn from best practices, principles within your organization or policies, and say, in that context, write the code for me. That would be amazing. So then it's sort of I can minimize that. I don't know these strategies, but do something like a CQRS pattern, for example, in Python. Write that for me so that so that I don't have to worry. But I don't really know what CQRS is really, but it's going to write that pattern for me. Great. So that's the kind of thing where I think you can accommodate some of those challenges we've been talking about, or our customers have asked.
Yeah, and leveraging data. I know those models are really good at identifying data types and those kinds of things, which, that was a lot of the struggle in converting from old systems to new systems. I think, again, we can leverage these tools to, move us into the future. Dealing with tech debt is another thing, right? That's how do we use what's available to us to get us out of the situation that we're in, regardless of how we got there, kind of thing. And I think that's what, tons of code's been written without comments in it. There's all kinds of stuff where those are the guys I'm just as guilty as you guys for those kinds of things. And even my own code, I'm like, what the heck? It's like, you think you're going to always remember what was going on, but it just doesn't happen. And I think that's where Copilot and those kinds of things are going to be super helpful as we move forward. And it's kind of the same thing from a security perspective or data class or any of the things that you talk about. Man, if you really had good governance in place that was followed, it's going to help you out. I think that's just a general statement of tech debt, is just understanding why you did a certain thing and having the appropriate comments and documentation are going to help you in the long run for sure.
Yeah, I'll hit on a topic one, and I spent a lot of time yesterday talking about with the group. It was basically ROI. And so in a lot of ways, you really need to be disciplined about thinking about your application estate, really understanding what are you using and what you're not using, and what's actually delivering on the value you expect it to. Because I think in a lot of ways we might say, yeah, there's a lot of technical debt, we're not going to touch it. But in some ways, I think, Juan, you brought this point up quite well yesterday. It's like, you just retire things. If you're not using them anymore, retire them. Don't be afraid to say, this thing, we don't need it anymore. Or there are other systems with a little bit of training we're able to replace. You can remove technical debt fairly easily just using those strategies, I think, which is really helpful.
Yeah, in the examples we talked about yesterday, we talked about engagements that we've done with our clients where they ask us to do relocations of their workloads. It could be data center to cloud, cloud to cloud, cloud to data center, lots of different iterations and permutations of that we've done. And on average, we see that about 30% of the workloads that are running in an environment, you could just turn them off and they won't do anything. And that's an easy way to retire a whole bunch of stuff, but it does require some work, right? And you have to be methodical and careful about it and all that.
And it does require some fortitude from the business perspective. Yeah. And I think that's, that's hard to sell to a certain part of the organization. It's easy to sell to another part of the organization. But I think that's, when we start to talk about transformation and solutions, it's really important to talk to everybody, to make sure leadership's on board, because to do those kinds of things, that's the same thing, that whole scream test, let's turn it off and see what happens, is kind of, we don't do it that way anymore, right? We have a very methodical way of understanding and what's going on and moving those capabilities. But I would guess hundreds of millions of dollars in the top 200 companies could be saved if we did an engagement like that. Literally, it would pay dividends back to the organizations to just take a look at that, because I think that it's way worse than you ever thought it was.
No, it's extensive. All right.
Yeah.
But I'm going to change the subject a little bit, because I'm going to forget if I don't get it out now. All right. As you keep on saying, pay me now, pay me later. All right. And that actually brings up an analogy that I've been using quite a bit that has resonated with our clients. And that's that technical debt is like credit card debt. All right. And we all use credit cards, right? And some of us are a lot more rigorous about using them. We use them essentially as floating credit. Personally, we pay it off at the end of the month and all that other stuff. So there's discipline in how we use that credit card. It's still relatively easy to get into a discipline where you are not being methodical about that and you get into credit card debt. Most of us in IT have treated our IT systems like a credit card and have not applied the rigor to managing our technical debt like we do our credit card debt. And if you can start applying some rigor, just like you do for your finances, you can probably apply it for your technical debt as well. You're still going to have it, but it'll be a shifting window rather than an ongoing forever expense.
And I love it because that analogy is perfect from the compound interest that happens with that. Because if it's not a topic of conversation for years, and then all of a sudden you start trying to talk about it, it's significantly more of an issue than it would have been had you talked about it all along.
That's exactly right.
Right. We got to figure out where the rewards points come from, though. So if you,
well, that's totally why I use a credit card. Yeah, like put it all in there and then get the points at the end of the month. Yeah.
Right. Well, maybe that's just that you don't have to worry about the technical debt, right? So those are the reward points.
But it's I love that we're having a fun conversation, but this is a really important point, is that we do have to apply that rigor to it, right? And it starts with in the original planning, understanding that whatever decision that you make today will become technical debt down the road, 100%. And keeping that in track and including it in your budgeting, so that as you go through the process of either budgeting time or money or both, or I mean, you can flip flop the two, right? That is included in your processes moving forward. So get yourself right and then plan moving forward. Just like any financial advisor would tell you to do, right?
Hey, we got a question here. It says tech debt's going to accelerate with companies adopting LLMs prematurely. I love this question. Or without proper planning. Can you talk about the skills needed to test and validate LLMs to prevent additional tech debt to grow? Or should we ask Congress to raise the debt ceiling?
That's good. That's somewhat loaded, but it's I do think that, well, interestingly, so Juan and I were talking to customers yesterday. I think many organizations are a little bit reluctant to start using it for production caliber coding today. So I think there is a healthy amount of skepticism to your first point, but I think there are lots of MVPs and proof of concepts happening. So I think organizations are really moving slowly or treading lightly into this area, at least to begin with. But the importance of your first point is that you really do need to think about what it does. And the way to test and validate is to, I'll call this education around prompt engineering, or understanding around how to actually test and validate the code that you might actually create. So you can build simple CI/CD pipelines, for example, within a test environment, or even automate through the LLM some mechanism or code generator, I'll say, for giving you the ability to not only create the code, but also create the test function that might be associated with it. And you can do that. I've seen it done before, and it actually works out really well. So I think that's one way to sort of take advantage of these tools, but it does require a degree of understanding how to interact. And I think, I can't remember who it was, but I was reading a paper from a computer science perspective. Computer science is going to start to become more about understanding principles, but then understanding the interaction with the model. And that's how you can create the sort of software that you're expecting. So I think that's a really valid skill. And Juan can talk about the debt ceiling. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. Actually, I'm gonna circle a little around the subtle point that Steve is making. Is how do we talk about the skills needed to validate large language models to prevent additional tech debt? And that's actually a very subtle question, because these large language models are trained on very large corpuses that might be biased or not biased, and we don't know that. All right. And you actually have to have some significant expertise in data science and data engineering and data architecture, and maybe even a moral compass, depending on what you're asking this large language model to do, to understand if this thing is trained the way you want to. And in fact, many of the models that are available publicly today, so OpenAI and Bard and the large list of all of these that are available out there, if you were to use them without guardrails, they very quickly become biased, they become misogynist, they become all sorts of nasty things. All right. So all of these companies are putting in guardrails around what these things are allowed to produce and come out with. And I think in a large measure, some of that is going to have to be part of what we have to depend on these larger organizations to do that. And the reason I say that is because understanding what that large language model is doing underneath the covers is still a black art. In fact, if you ask anybody that does these things and writes these things, they'll tell you, I don't know how it does what it does. I'm still trying to figure it out. Right. So we have to put a little bit of trust in that. And it might actually require Congress to be involved and start restricting how these technologies are being used.
I really hope we do it before we have to get government involved in helping us do it. But yeah, I agree.
Well, heck, Jason, I don't know if you saw it 2 days ago. The CEO of OpenAI was telling Congress, you need to put guardrails in place.
I saw it.
That was 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So.
And again, I think to your point, and so there's the thing, the early adopters, I think there's still a lot to gain from adopting this technology early on. And you've got to weigh the risk. There certainly is a risk, to your point, Juan.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those things where keep checking. Don't do it now and then look back in a year and see, hey, how we're doing. And I think really one of the things about that is if I can show ROI, so being able to show that return on what we're doing, and then when you look at the level of risk that you're exposed to, then people get to make a decision there, right? Is this worthy or not? And I think probably more purpose-built models for like coding or something very specific are probably going to be what comes out of this, or legal. I see a lot of healthcare. There's going to be some very specific ones that are trained now that everybody's kind of keen on the technology. I mean, they probably already exist. I'm talking like they don't. I'm
right.
Probably able to iterate 15 of them right now, but it's those are the kinds of things I see to kind of mitigate that risk.
Yeah, I think it's the use case probably that's most important here. And there are probably safer ways to use these different large language models. I mean, in the case of like, for example, GitHub Copilot, it's really based off of primarily trained a large language model related to coding. So it's slightly different from the general purpose ChatGPT, which can also generate code. But as Juan was saying, it does have bias. But the other thing you have to think about a little bit is, what does bias in code really mean? I mean, is it bad programming techniques? Potentially, but I would hope not. But but you really don't have to worry too much about ethical things in that case. So I mean, I think we can put some guards around what we mean by thinking about the general purpose use cases versus the more specific ones, because I don't want I guess I don't want people to worry about, oh, don't use it because we still have to wait to see what Congress is going to say. But for coding, it's like we can probably get we could probably use it immediately. And there are use cases where we're already demonstrating productivity with our customers, which I think we can do. So I think
that's a fair way to put it, Carmen. That's a really good point. And I hope it didn't come across as that you shouldn't use these. Because I think in fact you should, if not at least in an exploratory way, maybe for some lower hanging fruit that you just need easy help on, that is easy to validate the output of these things, right? And then as we get more familiar with these technologies, as they mature, we can start using them for harder problems inside of our organization.
Right.
And I think that's the thing. I don't think OpenAI, that was an indictment of what they were doing specifically. I think that was him saying, hey, we got to get some guardrails on this because, with enough compute, people could purpose build these things to do evil. And that's something we definitely need.
I think that was where he was coming from. That's exactly where he was coming from. Right.
Yeah.
But I do believe, man, we're sitting at a really awesome inflection point right now from a tech perspective where, again, solutions, and as we move forward, solutions to tech debt, and as we move forward, this is going to be something that if done properly, is going to allow us to rocket into the future to do some stuff, because there's a lot of stuff that you just can't get to because there's not enough time or not enough resources available for it. And I think with this kind of stuff, it's changing the game.
Jason, yesterday when we had those clients at our headquarters, Joyce Mullen, our CEO, came in and welcomed the crowd and thanked them for participating. And one of her comments as part of that was that, hey, every time I get in front of our clients, every year I say what an exciting time it is to be in the industry that we're in, right? And it's never been more exciting than it is now because of these things that we're just talking about, right? So it's exciting, it's super exciting, and I think she's right, and it's just going to continue to get more exciting. So it'll be a fun ride for the next little while.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's why kind of to wrap up, I think that's why taking an approach that deals with all of these things. I mean, how do you get yourself out of planning tech debt and obsolescence into your strategy is to think about it holistically not just thinking about that thing that you're trying to accomplish tactically right now, but thinking about how you can include, all of the thought process that you can. And again, that's where somebody who understands the tech, somebody who understands the strategy, someone who understands the organizational change management, all of those things, like what we do as we put together these solutions, it's an important thing to think about. And shameless plug, but I think that's one of those things that, why it's cool to work in an environment like this, because we've got folks like you guys and out there. First of all, we're looking ahead to make sure we're landing in the right spots, but also we understand how we got here and how we can kind of put it all together.
Yep. So it was a fun time, and thank you for calling us a smart guy. That's not me. That's definitely Carm.
Not at all, but it is important.
Okay, because I'll take it. I'm just joking.
With your phone. There's so much information, I think, that it's difficult for us to stay ahead of the game. So I think, we'll keep coming back and talking to the group about what are we learning as we go, but we would love to hear from all of you as well. Like, what are the use cases that you can see? And, certainly, because I think it's really a collaborative effort. We're all being impacted by this sort of movement into the generative AI world, but also tech debt, right? So it's, so certainly share your ideas with us and love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Carm. I think that's great. If you guys have some use cases or something you want us to walk through or situations, we would love to do that because we love to talk.
And we haven't even talked about the fun stuff that we've done for our clients. And there's great stories and great use cases on solving technical debt, as well as using some of these newer fun technologies to do that. So if you want to talk to us about that or actually read about it, Jason, you're going to point them in the right direction to go find some of this stuff, right?
Solutions.insight.com. We hope you guys will visit us there. And thanks for joining us today. And again, reach out if you want to hear some new topics or some new use cases. And thanks for watching. Thanks, guys.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.
Hang on.